Sugar diet obviously is gaining traction, momentum, hype on social media. You've got some pretty prevalent figures really hyping it up and promoting it, in which case you are exclusively consuming very high glycemic index sugars, fruits, honeys, syrups, leveraging candy, pure table sugars. I've seen a lot of gummy worms on social media, all the while losing body weight at a pretty impressive rate, 5-10 pounds a week. The whole concept behind it is basically that you are improving your metabolic rate. I obviously got a ton of questions on this, being pretty much the antithesis of the sugar diet, following the strict keto now for over a decade. Everything that people were wanting to do with the sugar diet, I basically did with the opposite of the sugar diet. What is going on, y'all? We got a very involved podcast today. I'm going to be going over my latest experiment, and I'm going to be flipping through several different windows. This would be optimal if you're viewing this on YouTube or in video format, as opposed to just listening to it in audio, but I'm going to try to explain everything so that's relevant if you're just listening to the audio. I was just going to do this solo, but I've actually got Greg here as well. He's going to kind of offer some banter back and forth, especially as I'm tabbing between slides and finding data, so there's not just this silence in between that. But I just conducted an experiment kind of in response to the sugar diet trend. So we're about to dive into that. Greg is currently on the sugar diet.
No, the opposite.
The opposite. So I'm excited. Everybody should know you, Greg, so no need to introduce you because everyone listens to you all the time anyways. But to give y'all a little backstory as to why this experiment was even conducted. So sugar diet obviously is gaining traction, momentum, hype on social media. You've got some pretty prevalent figures really hyping it up and promoting it. And the whole concept behind it is basically that you are improving your metabolic rate via the pathways of FGF21 hormone, which is risen, or basically pronounced when you reduce, as they claim, pretty much consume nothing but sugars. Therefore, your protein consumption is relatively low or non-existent. There's been multiple different protocols put out there as to how to best operate around it. I've seen a few of these different protocols. Some recommend sugar fasting, in which case you are exclusively consuming very high glycemic index sugars, fruits, honeys, syrups. A lot of people are promoting or leveraging candy, pure dextrose, sucrose, pure table sugars. I've seen a lot of gummy worms on social media. A lot of people using Mike-and-Ikes, things like that. So basically just pure sugar, whether it come from natural sources like fruit or, man-made sources like candy, for sugar fasting periods in which they'll have several days a week where they're only consuming sugar. And the whole concept has been to eat that ad libitum, so as much as you can consume or tolerate, all the while losing body weight at a pretty impressive rate. Some people touting the loss of, 5-10 pounds a week with this approach. I obviously got a ton of questions on this, being pretty much the antithesis of the sugar diet, following the strict keto now for over a decade. So I decided to actually peel the curtain back on what was happening here mechanistically and then conduct an experiment kind of in contrary to it, but using a similar pathway via this FGF21 hormone. So to give y'all even more backstory, I had just gone through like a 2-month period where I was gradually reducing my calories down to about 2,500, lost about 10-12 pounds in the process. So I was down at 2,500 calories when all of this sugar diet hype hit the fan. So I decided to do an experiment, but I wanted to kind of give myself kind of a period where I could eat more food, having come off of that slight deficit, which for me was not a major deficit. My maintenance intake, for context sake, is right around 3,000 calories. So I had basically a week post, I don't want to use the word mini cut, but for the listeners, we'll use that word. So I basically had a week after that 2,500 calorie drop where I ate ad libitum or, tried to average around 3,000 calories. I had a couple of days that were 4,500 calories. I had one day that was fasted, basically just kind of like a disconnect from that gradual reduction in intake that I've had over the past few months. So I had like a week washout period where I was doing that. which from scientific standpoint is not really a great washout period, but I'm a human being and not a lab mouse. So I wanted to just kind of do what I wanted to do from a nutrition standpoint. And then I was planning on jumping into this experiment. So I started doing that for a few days, and then Nick Norwitz reached out to me, asked if I wanted to do a more involved, study with this. I agreed, but due to that, variability in that week, I don't know if he'll use my data or not, but I have all my data, so I'm going to share it with you here. So let's dive into it. There's a study called from the Nature Metabolism journal, and the title of it is Dietary Protein Restriction Elevates FGF21 Levels and Energy Requirements to Maintain Body Weight in Lean Men. And for those listening, I'm just going to go ahead and read the abstract here, so bear with me. Dietary protein restriction increases energy expenditure and enhances insulin sensitivity in mice. However, the effects of eukcaloric protein restricted diets in healthy humans remains unexplored. Here, we show in lean, healthy men that a protein-restricted diet meeting the minimum protein requirements for 5 weeks necessitates an increase in energy intake to uphold body weight, regardless of whether proteins are replaced with fats or carbohydrates. Upon reverting to the customary higher protein intake in the following 5 weeks, energy requirements return to baseline levels, thus preventing weight gain. We also show that fasting plasma FGF21 levels increase during protein restriction. Proteomic analysis of human white adipose tissue and an FGF21 knockout mice reveal alterations in key components of the electron transport chain within white adipose tissue mitochondria. Notably, in male mice, these changes appear to be dependent on the FGF21. In conclusion, we demonstrate that maintaining body weight during dietary protein restriction in healthy lean men requires a higher energy intake, partially driven by FGF21 mediated mitochondrial adaptations in adipose tissue. So, that's a mouthful. Going into it now, the whole premise of this experiment was basically to do the opposite of the sugar diet to illustrate what would happen in me if I replaced what people are using sugar with higher fat intake, all the while keeping protein incredibly low. That would, in theory, also increase FGF21 and result in a similar response. Now, I am in a building phase right now. I do not want to go into a caloric deficit because that would be counterproductive to me building more lean tissue. So I wanted to do this and see if I could increase my total intake above baseline and see if I could maintain weight, which would, in theory, mean that if I was to keep the same caloric intake, I would drop weight. But again, I'm not trying to drop weight right now. So in essence, high level view, if people were to do this, they would basically have a similar response to what people are doing with the sugar diet, by way of, minimizing protein consumption to increase FGF21. If they were to do so at a maintenance caloric intake, they would in theory lose weight. I was not trying to lose weight, so I bumped up my intake significantly. Does all that make sense so far, Greg?
Yes.
All right. So let's dive into it. I decided to, again, take my maintenance intake, which was about 3,000 calories, and then be very aggressive with the increase. So I decided to make my new intake 4,000 calories. So an additional 1,000 calories above baseline. And I was targeting nearly a 4-to-1 ratio, 4-to-1 being defined as carbohydrates plus protein in grams, times 4 is how much fat you need to consume to have that 4-to-1 ratio. I think Nick was doing it based off of net carbs and not total carbs. So I was following a similar protocol. So I was a little shy of a true 4-to-1, but the study that was done in the Nature Metabolism magazine or article basically had protein at 9% or less of total calories for the day. So every day throughout this experiment, I targeted 9% or fewer calories from protein as a percentage of total caloric intake for the day, which for me wound up being around 400 grams of fat, 75 to 85 grams of protein a day, and depending on what I was consuming, 30 to 50 grams of total carbohydrates for the day typically. I was using a lot more like cauliflower rice to soak up oils and stuff. So to kind of illustrate what a typical day of eating for me was over this 2-week span, I would wake up, I'd have, a tablespoon of ghee in my coffee along with some heavy cream. On this particular day, I had some of that, what's that stuff called? It's like the mascarpone cheese, peanut butter, macadamia nuts, a keto brick or two, more ghee, and then more macadamia nuts. And then for dinner, the big hack that I had to hit this high fat intake was I would have a can of cod liver, which is pretty much 500 calories primarily coming from fat. There would still be the liver in there. I'd have that. I'd have that soaking up with a bunch of cauliflower rice. Usually I was doing 200 to 300 grams of that a day. I put some Primal Kitchen dipping sauce in there to increase the fat. Cook a few eggs in there with it, with 2 tablespoons of butter, 2 tablespoons of ghee, to pretty much hit that target intake. This day, for instance, my intake was 4,053 calories, and that was 86.6 grams of protein, 62 grams of carbs. That may have been the highest carb day, most of which is coming from the fiber in the cauliflower rice, and then 391 grams of fat. So pretty significant increase in dietary fat. Normally, I'm consuming around 200 to 250 grams of fat, and most often with this, I was around 400 grams of fat. Going into it, I thought I was going to have a ton of GI distress, but honestly, I had zero GI distress. I had no loose stool. That was honestly one of the biggest surprises. I had no GI.
I was going to
issues.
ask you about that. Yeah.
Yeah, it was pretty smooth.
That's a little bit of a shock to your normal.
Yeah, definitely a higher increase in fat and very little protein relative to my normal consumption. So that's what a typical day of eating looked like throughout this 2-week span. And then if we look at my other chronometer data here from a visual standpoint, just to kind of give y'all some context, this period here was where I was actually in that quote-unquote mini cut, and then I had a few refeed ad libitum days. I fasted one day. That's what that was. I actually did not track these 2 days, but that was probably 2 5,000 calorie days. So a pretty high intake to kind of just eat whatever I wanted to for that span, which basically defeats the purpose of having a lead-in a week, but, you know, I'm a human, not a mouse. So this span here, I started the experiment on June 9th, and I went until the 23rd of June. So pretty much consuming around 4,000 calories that entire span. And then that's what I'm looking like there. And if we look at my weight over that span as well, after those 2 5,000 calorie days and kind of ad libitum eating, my weight did jump up quite a bit, which I would have expected. I think I went from 176 at my lowest during that mini cut. I don't even like the word that I'm using, mini cut, but people understand that. And then after having a week of consuming more food and, you know, 2 pretty high caloric intake days, my weight jumped to 183.2. All right. And then I started the experiment on the 9th at a weight of 183.2. So that's where the 4,000 calories basically started. There's a little bit of a discrepancy there because, again, I was eating less, ate a whole lot more, and then my weight jumped up largely from water retention from eating more, saltier foods, things like that. But over that span, while eating 4,000 calories, my weights had a little bit of an increase in the first few days, and then you can see it just steadily dropping throughout the time of the experiment. I believe on the last day of the experiment, June 23rd, my weight was 179.2. So pretty much flushed out that water and then dropped to just right above where I was. But just keep in mind, here I'm eating 4,000 calories, whereas before I was eating 2,500 calories. So pretty impressive from a weight standpoint there. For all intents and purposes, it was holding stable or dropping relative to what I would be at baseline intake of 3,000 calories. Now, if we look at my AI dashboard of this experiment to do a little bit more of a deep dive here, you can see just that span of time. And I am, again, starting the experiment at about 183 on 6/9. And then you can kind of see the trend line holding pretty stable or actually taking a dip there towards the end. So, you know, pretty impressive trend line while eating significantly more food. And here you can see my protein consumption throughout the whole time at about 9% of total calories. Carbs were at about 6% of total calories. And then fat was typically around 85 to 87% of total calories coming from fat throughout that experiment. And then over the course of that span, my average caloric intake was 4,100, 3,986. So pretty much right there around 4,000 calories. Now, I decided to get blood work both. When did I got the first lab on the 25th, I believe. So a little bit in the middle of that intermediary week. And then again on the last day of the experiment. I anticipated a significant increase in my lipid panel, triglycerides, cholesterol.
Sure.
I was kind of expecting that since I had so much more fat coming in relative to my baseline. Now, I am very deeply fat adapted, but I assumed with this much fat intake over baseline, I would see those numbers increase. But when I actually got the lab markers, I saw a very different outlook. So let's go to the lab results here. Greg, you're kind of in a cut right now. Does 4,000 calories of pure fat sound appealing?
Nice.
Or no?
I would not complain about that. That'd be nice.
All right, so look at these two panels. This is basically when I got my first draw at 529, and then again on the last day of the experiment on 623. My total cholesterol went from 274 to 276, so not much of a change there. HDL cholesterol went from 91 to 106, so not a significant change there, but HDL actually improved. LDL went from 165 to 155, so LDL dropped. Triglycerides went from 77 to 57, so I thought that was a little interesting. There's a whole bunch of markers here. HDL ratio went from 3 to 2.6. Triglyceride to HDL ratio went from 0.85 to 0.54. So pretty much for all intents and purposes, an improvement in lipid markers. My ApoB A1 ratio stayed steady at 0.53. Glucose is consistent, 91 both times. Let me just scroll down here. The main thing I want to talk about is the hormones, because this one really surprised me, shocked me.
You were telling us about that.
So let's see if I could scroll down to find that. So just to kind of give people some context, I've never had super high testosterone. That's why, Greg, one of the funny things, people will always accuse me of taking steroids.
Yeah, right. Or TRT or anything.
Yeah, but like I get on my lab work, and I think when I was at 3.9% in my prep, I hit like 86 or 87 as total testosterone. So obviously not taking gear. But yeah, I've never been one to have super high testosterone. Typically, I'm around like 400 to 600 is pretty average for me. But when I go down to hormones, my total testosterone serum at the time of the experiment starting was 334 total testosterone. So not that great. After the experiment was over, it more than doubled and went to 696.
That's crazy.
So it literally more than doubled in that span while eating minimal protein and significantly high dietary fat. My sex hormone binding globulin did increase a little bit, so it went from 60 to 87, so that's not great. But if I could have found a way to unbind some of that testosterone, my free testosterone would be even higher. And then for some reason on Heads Up Health here, my free testosterone is not showing, but I have that as well. Let me sign in. I guess it must have logged me out. Say something, Greg.
That's pretty wild. Were you expecting it to go in any certain direction, or were you kind of just open-minded?
Yeah, I honestly didn't really expect any change in hormones, especially over such a short time span. But yeah,
that's a pretty significant change too. That's just not like a questionable little bit of a variation. That's a notable amount.
So here we've got IGF-1, and that went from, let's see here, it's 81 now. If I look at overtime, so my IGF-1 went from 107 to 81. So that one actually dropped a little bit. Estradiol, that went from 8 to 22. So that one increased. Cortisol, interesting marker there. That one actually dropped a little bit. It went from 12.4 to 9.9. Insulin. See, a lot of the reasons people were doing this is to improve insulin sensitivity.
Sure. My
insulin went from, that's all the way back in May. I guess I didn't get insulin tested the first time, but it ended at 2.5. And then let's see here.
There's your free test.
Yeah, free test. All right. So my free testosterone, which is the one that really matters, went from, that's total. Free testosterone went from 27.8. So again, pretty low. And that also pretty much doubled and landed at 58.7 over the course of this experiment. So my total testosterone effectively doubled, my free testosterone effectively doubled, and all of my lipid markers improved while eating 1,000 extra calories. A ton of fat, and less than 9% of my calories coming from protein.
No protein.
So super interesting there. One other graph here to kind of show a visual. This is my weight and calories graphed out in tandem from a heads-up health standpoint. And again, you see all this volatility here. That was during that week period. It's dropping during that quote-unquote mini-cut. And then over the course of the experiment, pretty much holding stable from a weight standpoint and actually starting to drop a little bit throughout it. So super interesting there. So what does all of this mean? And this is kind of where it gets relevant for you, Greg. So what I'm thinking, first of all, everything that people were wanting to do with the sugar diet, I basically did with the opposite of the sugar diet. I showed that eating 1,000 calories more didn't result in an increase in body weight over that span. So had I kept calories consistent at 3,000 of my baseline, I probably would have seen a significant drop in body weight, which is the main reason people are doing the sugar diet. Like there's been polls done and most people are doing it to lose a lot of weight really quickly. So had I wanted to lose weight, I feel like I could have effectively done that with this experiment. Now, a couple other things to note is that doing it this way, as opposed to eating, sweet tarts and apples and,
Sour Patch
gummy
Kids.
worms, Sour Patch Kids, I'm eating real food the whole time. So from an insulin sensitivity standpoint, I don't think there was any issues with what I had from my blood work and markers. And the main thing is I just ate real food the whole time. Like I'm a huge advocate for eating real food.
Yeah, you had nutrient dense choices.
Yeah. Like I'm playing the long game with everything. And like one of the big question marks that I have with the people doing the sugar diet is, what are they going to do in the next 5 years? Like, are they going to be doing the same thing in 5 years? Or are they going to have too many cavities to be able to eat any food? And, what are they going to do?
I think what's interesting is all the foods that you used to leverage the super high fat intake are still the same foods you could eat today off this protocol.
Yeah.
Whereas the sugar diet, people are leveraging candy and Twizzlers and high glycemic fruit juice and all that kind of stuff. When they stop the sugar diet, they probably aren't going to be consuming that. So like they're going from whatever they're eating beforehand to just an insane amount of sugar in these food choices that are just serving them a temporary change. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Not great.
But your food choices are the same. They're just elevated.
Yeah. So in light of all this information, I think there's probably two use case scenarios that I think this could be really effective. Because like when you look at it on a big level, it's advocating pretty low protein. I mean, I was consuming 4,000 calories, 9% of that coming from protein, putting me at like 75, 85 grams of protein a day, which is not very much. That's definitely in stark contrast to the 1 gram of protein per pound of lean mass that you see thrown around a lot. Do I think, am I doing this to advocate people consume a ton of fat and hardly any protein? Not at all. I don't think that is optimal long-term from a longevity standpoint, from a health standpoint, from a muscle building and retention standpoint. But from a metabolic standpoint, I think this could be leveraged in a useful manner in both a building phase and a cutting phase. So from a building phase standpoint, I'm looking at myself right now. I'm in a building phase. I like the idea of my testosterone doubling. That's pretty cool. I don't know if anybody that's doing the sugar diet tested hormones, but I would be doubtful that eating sweet tarts has resulted in a doubling of their testosterone. Maybe they can prove me wrong, but I'm highly unlikely of that. So in a building phase or anytime really, you want to optimize testosterone, especially as a natural athlete. So the fact that my testosterone literally doubled in this span, I could leverage that, intermittently throughout a building phase to keep those levels higher at a baseline. So what I would like to do for myself is kind of treat this in a similar fashion to how I would an extended fast. I'm not an advocate for extended fasting to change body composition. I'm not an advocate of extended fasting while also being in a caloric deficit. It's too many stressors on the body. But when I'm eating at a surplus and I'm eating more protein on a day-to-day basis, I mean, that is taxing on your digestive system, and just eating a lot of food is taxing on your digestive system. So I'll, throw in an extended fast on a quarterly or, biannually basis in a building phase. And I think I could treat this in a similar fashion. So once a quarter, probably do 1 week of this 4-to-1 ratio. Sure. That's going to ramp up my metabolic rate. It's going to obviously effectively keep my testosterone functioning at a high rate, and it'll be less protein coming in to give my digestive system a break. So on a quarterly basis, in the context of a build, I think a week of 4-to-1, lower protein, higher fat, and then either equal or slightly higher calories could be advantageous. In the other setting, it would be beneficial, and we're going to experiment on this with you, is if you are in an extended cut. It's like my last cut was 33 weeks long. Your current cut is, how many weeks are you in right now?
Oh boy, since January.
So pretty good while. And then depending on how your shows go, you may be competing until November. So that's like a whole year, 12 months. That's a lot of weeks in a deficit. If you were just, consistently drop intake throughout that whole span, granted we're going to be doing refeeds. We have been doing refeeds with you, keto refeeds. That's still a long time in a deficit, which is going to inevitably result in a down play on your testosterone, your metabolic rates, energy levels, all that jazz. So if you're in an extended cut like that, offer a week where your calories are actually increased a little bit, your fat ratio is higher, your protein's a little bit lower, and that results in an uptick of testosterone or metabolic rate, that would bode well for you elongating that cut even more in a healthy fashion. So just using you as an example, you're actually in peak week at the time of this recording. You've been in a cut since January. Your calories are pretty low right now. What do I have you at this week?
They're right around 1,800.
1,800 calories. So after your show this weekend, you've got another 2.5 months before your next show. So what we'll probably do with you is next week, post first show, we'll bump up your intake to maybe 2,500 calories at this 4-to-1 ratio. So it's going to be pretty low protein for you, but we'll only sustain it for a week. And then we'll probably just do it for a week as opposed to 2 weeks. And that, in essence, should increase your metabolic rate, probably give you a benefit testosterone-wise. And then after that week is over, rather than dropping you back down to 1,800, because of that increased metabolic rate, we may only need to drop you to like 2,200. So you'll effectively have, 400 calories more runway going into the week following this high fat ratio than you would had we not done the high fat ratio. So we can more healthfully continue your cut without any unnecessary downward trend in your metabolic rate or hormone levels.
Sweet. I like it.
So that's the plan.
Essentially, you're looking at, if you're on one of the bottom couple rungs of a ladder, we're going to take a step back up 1 or 2 rungs. So we have the rest of that ladder to come back down again.
Yeah. And if we were to do the same thing, calorically speaking, but at your current macro distribution, that may not have a similar effect to your hormones, or you would likely risk putting on more weight. And we don't want to take 1 step forward and 2 steps back from a weight standpoint with you in a prep right now. But if we can give you an extra 400 calories as a baseline from which to continue the taper, increase your metabolic rate, increase your hormone levels, that's going to be super positive for you in an extended prep.
Yeah.
I don't think people that are doing like a shorter cut, like 12 weeks or 16 weeks would benefit from this, likely. But with you being in a, practically year-long cut, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I like it.
So
definitely rather try this and see what this yields than just throwing a ton of cardio in there.
Yeah, for sure. A couple other things to note apart from the data, just observations throughout doing it. I was eating an extra 1,000 calories, but man, my hunger that first week especially really ramped up. I think it's because my food volume actually wasn't that high, because when you're not eating much protein, you don't have very much food volume. I had the cauliflower rice to help soak up some of the fat that I was consuming, but actually a reduction in overall food volume. So hunger increased, which honestly kind of illustrated the increase in metabolic rate as well, because like when your metabolism is ramped up, your hunger increases. That seemed to subside after about a week and a half in. Like my hunger seemed to stabilize after a week and a half, which leads me to believe that my metabolism started to stabilize as well. So I don't think there would have been a benefit to doing it any longer, because I wanted to kind of benefit from that stoking of the metabolic flames, so to speak.
Sure.
So I don't think you'd want to do it for longer periods of time. And obviously throughout this experiment, my protein was low. So people have pegged me as the high fat, low protein guy. I'm not that at all. Like like yesterday I had 200 grams of protein. Like I'm not low protein by any means. But one thing that I find funny is that people in the bodybuilding space for sure, but even in the keto space as well, they've always just kind of like left protein as a standalone constant. They don't change it, whether their goal is to build or to cut. Like they leave protein pretty stable. They'll cut, fat if the goal is to lose fat. They'll keep carbs low if they're doing a keto or a carnivore approach. But they've always been really protective of that protein. And from day one, I've always said, hey, look, you can get away with using protein as one of the levers you can manipulate if you do it in a healthy manner,
right,
without any risk of loss of lean tissue. My first ketogenic prep in 2017, on the very tail end of it, I brought my protein all the way down to 65 grams, which I'm not advocating for, but I wanted to see how far I could push it without any loss of lean tissue. And in the context of being very fat adapted, having higher circulating ketones, my strength markers held constant. I didn't lose any skeletal muscle tissue even with my protein that low.
That's pretty wild.
So I don't want people to hear this and say, okay, I'm dropping protein to the floor, ramping fat up, because you got to be strategic with it. But I do hope people recognize that you've got 3 levers to manipulate. And as far as nutrition goes, you got your fats, proteins, and carbs. If you're doing keto or carnivore, your carbs are pretty much non-existent. So that's not even a lever anymore. So then you've got your fat and protein. Just simply manipulating fat is leaving 50% of the table, 50% on the table that you could leverage and benefit from. So this was insightful in that regard for sure. What else did I say when I was going through this experiment? Anything else notable?
I remember you saying you were hungry.
Definitely hungry.
You got to consume a little extra keto brick.
Yeah, I think one day I had like 2 or 3 keto brick. And that's where some of the carbs were coming from too.
There's just trace carbs in some of those.
Yeah. And like eggs, trace carbs, and heavy cream, trace carbs. I was eating a lot of that SCT oil, which is really good.
Oh, yeah.
So it's a short chain triglyceride. I'm trying to remember the brand. It was like Happy Healthy or something like that. But it was super good and didn't mess with my gut at all. But I was putting that in my coffee. I was putting that on the bricks. So that short chain triglyceride.
How was your mental acuity and stuff during that?
It was good. I don't like feeling hungry. And again, I felt hungry that in the first week. I felt a little tired in the morning. It seemed a little bit longer to get going. And I think that may have been because I was just eating so much food. It was almost like I had so much fuel coming in that, kind of akin to like a motor, I was basically flooding it, so to speak, flooding myself with so much fuel that I didn't need that much fuel. So I just kind of felt a little nausea in the beginning too. I think I just had so much energy coming into my system that it kind of backfired in that regard. But again, all that kind of leveled off after about a week and a half. And then I only had another half week before I, called it quits on the experiment. But there was that I noticed. But like all my strength markers were totally fine. Didn't see any reduction in strength whatsoever. I was getting good pumps while training. All of my blood markers obviously improved, so no complaints there. I did miss like a big old steak though, man. Like I was
yeah, you didn't have much to chew on.
Yeah, I didn't have much to chew on. So from a texture standpoint, I was craving like when the experiment was over, like one of the first things I ate was a big old rotisserie chicken. I just wanted a whole bunch of protein and just chewing on some meat tissue, But for like a week, which I think would probably be the ideal time to do this, you can do anything for a week. And honestly, the cod liver, which is a great source of vitamin A and all kinds of other good stuff, that cooked in with the cauliflower rice and a few scrambled eggs in there.
I bet that was good.
Super tasty.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty big bowl of food with like 300 grams cauliflower rice. So that was pretty filling. So that was good. So yeah, all in all, I think it was a success. I am curious to try and do the same thing at my keeping the calories constant. So rather than, it's like right now I've been averaging about 3,000 calories, kind of back to baseline. I'll probably do this same experiment for a week and keep calories at 3,000 just to see what happens compositionally speaking. That would mean my protein would be even lower to hit that 4-to-1 ratio at a reduced intake. But for a week, I think that'd be totally sustainable, and I'm curious to see what happens.
Yeah.
So
track the data.
Yeah, from a title clickbaity standpoint, we could effectively say I naturally more than doubled my testosterone doing the opposite of the sugar diet.
Sugar diet.
So yeah, not throwing shade. I mean, people do whatever they want to do. But
this is insightful though.
Yeah, I think this was insightful for me. I mean, it's kind of doing the same thing that we're doing with the ketogenic caloric refeeds in the context of your prep, but just kind of on the other end of the spectrum with an increase in calories over baseline as opposed to an increase in macros acutely in the context of a deficit.
Yep.
So yeah, I mean, it makes total sense. I didn't get like FGF21 plasma tested, so I'd be curious to know what that level was pre and post. But I was super pleased with all the hormone markers and lipid panel. And I think this will probably be something that I throw into the mix similar to my extended fast on a somewhat quarterly basis or something like that.
Cool.
And in the context of a prep.
Another tool in the toolbox.
Another tool in the toolbox. So appreciate y'all for tuning in. Appreciate you, Greg, for being my sidekick here.
With pleasure.
And we'll do this for you in the prep. You'll be the guinea pig in the context of a deficit, and we'll do a follow-up work podcast for sure, kind of diving into some of the results there. So
sweet. I'm excited. This will be cool.
Yes, indeed. Till next time, y'all. Stay savage and always be experimenting.
Ta-ta.